Bolingbrook, Illinois, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where rows of neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences stood as symbols of the American dream. In this serene community, Drew Peterson lived, a decorated police officer, a family man, and someone everyone seemed to admire. His uniform presence at local events, his polite smiles and firm handshakes painted the picture of a protector. But for Kathleen Savio, his third wife, that image was only a mask. Kathleen, a vibrant woman with an infectious laugh, had met Drew years earlier. Their marriage started with promises of love and partnership, but over the years, the cracks began to show. Drew's charm, the same quality that had won her heart, turned into a weapon he wielded to control her life. Kathleen's once vibrant social life shrank to almost nothing. Friends stopped visiting. She told her sister, "Drew doesn't like people coming over. He likes things his way." At first, the arguments were small. Kathleen would shrug them off, chalking them up to Drew's demanding career. But as time passed, his temper grew more unpredictable. His accusations of infidelity, his need to know her every move, it all became suffocating. She confided in a close friend, whispering late at night over the phone, "I don't know if I'm going crazy or if it's him." The community, however, saw none of this. To them, Drew was the ever-reliable officer, keeping their streets safe. His patrol car was a familiar sight, his stories of work a source of admiration. At family gatherings and block parties, he laughed loudly, made toasts, and seemed the epitome of a devoted husband. Kathleen played along, smiling when needed, but her laughter no longer reached her eyes. Behind closed doors, things escalated. Drew's possessiveness turned into verbal abuse, then physical intimidation. He never left visible marks, but his words cut deep. Kathleen began documenting everything. A small notebook hidden in her dresser became her confidant. "If something happens to me," she wrote in shaky handwriting, "look at Drew. He's the reason." The final straw came when Kathleen found something that shattered the fragile peace of their home. A note from another woman, Stacy Peterson, 19 years old, vibrant, and utterly captivated by Drew's charm. Kathleen confronted him. The fight was explosive. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting, the crash of furniture, and a door slamming. But Drew's response wasn't apologetic. It was chilling. "You think you can leave me?" he spat. "You'll never be free of me." Kathleen told her lawyer everything. She wanted a divorce, but she also wanted safety for herself and her children. She began the grueling legal process, enduring Drew's attempts to undermine her at every turn. He used his position in law enforcement to his advantage, intimidating her and controlling the narrative. Yet despite her fears, Kathleen held her ground. For those outside their home, life in the Peterson household seemed to go on without issue. Drew continued his patrols, his jovial demeanor intact. Kathleen went to work, put on a brave face for her kids, and hoped the storm would pass. But inside, she was unraveling. The anxiety kept her awake at night. Every creak in the floorboards, every sound from the street made her heart race. She began to doubt her own instincts. Was she overreacting? Or was Drew truly capable of following through on his threats? The Petersons' neighbors remained oblivious to the tension. Their quiet street seemed unshakable, immune to the darkness that now clouded Kathleen's world. But cracks like these, hidden beneath smiles and small talk, always find a way to surface. And for Kathleen, they would soon shatter everything. Kathleen Savio sat alone at her kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. In front of her lay a manila folder, its contents scattered, a tangled mess of legal documents, receipts, and handwritten notes. She ran her fingers over the papers, her mind racing. This was her life now. Court dates, custody battles, and sleepless nights. The man she once loved was now her greatest fear. The divorce proceedings were far from amicable. Drew Peterson, ever the charmer in public, had turned the legal process into a battlefield. He contested everything: custody, property, even the smallest financial details. "He's dragging this out to break me," Kathleen told her sister in a whispered phone call. "It's not about the kids or the money. It's about control." Drew's influence as a police officer loomed over every aspect of the case. Kathleen felt it in the way her lawyer hesitated to challenge him directly, the subtle looks exchanged between officials at the courthouse. "He knows everyone," she thought bitterly, "and they all believe him." But it wasn't just the legal battles that wore her down. It was the way Drew made her feel small, powerless. The arguments had escalated. Once he showed up at her house unannounced, pounding on the door until she opened it. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he said, "I just want to talk." But his eyes told a different story. He stepped inside without waiting for her to answer, his presence filling the small entryway. Kathleen's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to push him out, but she froze. "You think you're going to win this?" Drew asked, his tone steady but laced with menace. "You don't get to walk away from me, Kathleen. I'll make sure of it." After he left, she locked the door and slid down to the floor, trembling. She called her lawyer the next day, recounting the incident. His response was measured. "Unless he physically harms you or leaves evidence, it's just his word against yours." That was the problem, wasn't it? Drew never left evidence. He was careful, calculating. Kathleen knew she was dealing with someone who understood the system better than anyone, someone who could manipulate it to his advantage. Her fears weren't paranoia. They were grounded in the cold reality of who Drew Peterson was. One day, while searching through old paperwork in the basement, Kathleen stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a bank statement, jointly held during their marriage, but it showed a withdrawal she hadn't authorized. Thousands of dollars had disappeared. She traced the date back to the weeks leading up to their separation, and it all clicked. Drew wasn't just trying to control her emotionally, he was trying to destroy her financially too. Kathleen's discovery fueled her determination. She handed the evidence to her lawyer and started documenting everything, every phone call, every visit, every veiled threat. She even kept a small recorder in her purse, just in case. "I need to protect myself," she told her sister. "If something happens to me, people need to know." But even as she took steps to shield herself, Drew's behavior grew more unpredictable. He began showing up at the boys' soccer games unannounced, not to watch, but to confront her. His words were always laced with threats disguised as concern. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said one afternoon, his voice low and steady. Kathleen felt the eyes of other parents on her, their polite smiles masking confusion. She wanted to scream, but instead she just nodded, hoping he'd leave. The cracks in Drew's public image began to show. Rumors swirled in the community, neighbors whispering about the shouting matches at Kathleen's house, Drew's frequent absences from family events. Still, no one dared confront him directly. He was Drew Peterson, the cop who knew everyone, the man who could make problems disappear. One evening, Kathleen sat in her living room staring at a letter she'd written weeks earlier. It was addressed to her lawyer and outlined everything she feared, her suspicions about Drew, the threats he'd made, the financial manipulation. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone. "What if no one believes me?" she thought. "What if this makes it worse?" But deep down she knew she didn't have a choice. The first crack in her world had appeared long ago, but now the foundation was crumbling. She dialed the number, her heart pounding with every ring. "I want to file for an emergency order of protection," she said when her lawyer answered. Her voice trembled, but there was steel in her tone. "I'm done being afraid." The morning of March 1st, 2004 began like any other in Bolingbrook. The hum of suburbia, the sound of leaf blowers, the distant chatter of children walking to school echoed through the quiet streets. But inside Kathleen Savio's home, silence reigned. A silence so still, so unnatural, it would soon unravel the calm facade of this peaceful community. It was Kathleen's neighbor, alarmed by the lack of response to repeated knocks, who first suspected something was wrong. "She hasn't answered her phone all weekend," the neighbor told the police when they arrived. "It's not like her." The officers hesitated, reluctant to force their way into the home. But when they finally entered, the sight that greeted them froze them in their tracks. Kathleen's lifeless body lay in the dry bathtub, her head tilted awkwardly, her dark hair soaked with blood. The stark white of the tub contrasted with the purple bruises on her arms and legs. There was no water in the tub, no sign of a struggle in the bathroom, yet something about the scene felt staged. Within an hour, Drew Peterson arrived. His police-issued SUV pulled up to the curb with an almost eerie calm. As he stepped out, his expression remained unreadable. He didn't rush inside or demand answers. Instead, he lingered at the doorway, speaking softly with the officers on the scene. One witness later recalled, it was like he already knew. Drew's explanation was simple. Kathleen must have slipped. "She's clumsy," he said, shaking his head as though lamenting an inevitable tragedy. "She was always falling over herself." He didn't cry. He didn't shout. His demeanor was disturbingly controlled. The medical examiner, called to the scene shortly after, performed a cursory examination. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbed furniture in the house, but the injuries on Kathleen's body told a more complicated story. A laceration on the back of her head, bruises on her wrists and thighs, details that couldn't easily be dismissed. Yet despite these irregularities, the initial ruling leaned toward accidental drowning. Kathleen's family, upon hearing the news, erupted in disbelief. "Accident!" her sister Anna exclaimed. "You think she accidentally drowned in a bathtub with no water in it?" But their voices went unheard. Drew's colleagues in the police department, many of whom had known him for years, seemed reluctant to question his version of events. The following days were a blur of half-hearted investigations and unanswered questions. Drew appeared on local news stations, offering his condolences to Kathleen's family while subtly steering the narrative. "She was a great mother," he said during one interview, his tone oddly detached. "It's a terrible loss for all of us." Behind closed doors, however, Kathleen's family began their own search for the truth. Her sister found the notebook Kathleen had hidden in her dresser. Its pages were filled with scribbled fears and ominous warnings. "He said he would kill me. He said no one would believe it." They brought this evidence to the police, but it was dismissed as irrelevant, a byproduct of a contentious divorce. The autopsy report, released weeks later, concluded that Kathleen's death was consistent with accidental drowning. Despite the inconsistencies, the case was officially closed. Drew moved forward with alarming ease, his life seemingly untouched by tragedy. Within months, he had proposed to Stacy Cales, his much younger girlfriend, and begun planning their wedding. But whispers persisted in the community. Kathleen's neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the bruises they'd seen on her arms in the weeks before her death. Her co-workers recalled how she'd often seemed distracted, nervous, as though she were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "She was scared of him," one colleague confided. "I don't know why, but she was." As for Drew, he maintained his innocence with unnerving confidence. At family gatherings and social events, he laughed easily, his charming persona fully intact. But to those who looked closer, there was something else. A faint crack in the mask, a subtle shift in his gaze when Kathleen's name was mentioned, a quick change of subject when her death came up in conversation. For Kathleen's family, the loss was unbearable, but their fight for answers had only just begun. "We know the truth," her sister Anna said, tears streaming down her face during a memorial service. "We just need the world to see it too." Less than 6 months after Kathleen's death, Drew Peterson married Stacy Cales in a small, hastily arranged ceremony. Stacy, just 19 years old, looked radiant in her white dress, her bright smile masking the unease that only she could feel. Drew, 30 years her senior, stood beside her, exuding confidence and pride. To the outside world, it appeared as though he'd found love again. But for those who knew Kathleen, the speed of the marriage felt unsettling. Whispers spread, but no one dared confront Drew. At first, Stacy found solace in her new life. Drew showered her with gifts and compliments, painting a picture of a loving husband. She moved into his home and became stepmother to his children from previous marriages. But beneath the surface, Drew's true nature quickly began to emerge. His controlling behavior, once subtle and masked by charm, grew more pronounced. He insisted on knowing where Stacy was at all times, demanded access to her phone, and monitored her interactions with friends and family. "Why do you need to talk to them so much?" Drew would ask, whenever Stacy called her sister Cassandra. His voice carried an edge, soft enough to feign concern, but sharp enough to silence her protests. Stacy began to withdraw, afraid to stir his anger. One evening, as Stacy unpacked boxes in the basement, she stumbled across a small, battered folder tucked behind a stack of old police files. Curious, she opened it. Inside were documents related to Drew's divorce from Kathleen, legal papers, custody agreements, and a letter Kathleen had written to her lawyer. The words leapt off the page. "He told me he could kill me and no one would ever prove it." Stacy's hands shook as she read the letter again. The realization hit her like a wave. Kathleen had been terrified of Drew, and now she was living in the same house, married to the same man. Stacy's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of what she knew. Kathleen's death had been ruled an accident, but something about Drew's behavior unsettled her. She thought about his cold, detached demeanor when he spoke of Kathleen, how he dismissed her death with casual remarks like she was clumsy or it was bound to happen. Stacy wanted to believe it was all coincidence, that she was imagining things, but deep down, she knew better. Drew, oblivious to Stacy's discovery, continued to tighten his grip on her life. He began showing up unannounced at places she visited, appearing at the grocery store or the salon with a disarming smile. "Just checking in," he'd say, his eyes scanning the room for anyone who might challenge his presence. Stacy felt the walls closing in. Her isolation deepened as Drew manipulated her relationships. He discouraged her from visiting her family, planting seeds of doubt with remarks like, "They don't really care about you," or "I'm the only one who looks out for you." Stacy found herself questioning her own instincts. Maybe Drew was right. Maybe this was normal. The turning point came during an argument late one night. Stacy, emboldened by frustration, mentioned Kathleen's letter. "What did she mean, Drew?" she demanded, holding the crumpled paper in her hand. Drew's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His face darkened, his voice dropping to a cold, calculated tone. "Don't ever bring her up again," he said, stepping closer. "You don't know what you're talking about." Stacy's fear was palpable, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "You can't control me forever," she said, her voice shaking. Drew smiled, a chilling, almost predatory smile. "You'd be surprised what I can do," he replied. The conversation ended there, but the unspoken threat lingered in the air. In the days that followed, Stacy reached out to her sister Cassandra in secret. She confided her fears, sharing what she had found, and her growing suspicion that Drew was responsible for Kathleen's death. "I feel like I'm next," she whispered. Cassandra, horrified, urged Stacy to leave, but Stacy hesitated. Drew had made it clear, leaving wasn't an option. Stacy's growing unease began to seep into her daily life. Her once bright demeanor dulled. Her laughter, once genuine, now sounded forced. Friends noticed the change but didn't know how to help. Drew, ever the skilled manipulator, maintained his image as a devoted husband. He attended family barbecues, played with the kids in the yard, and smiled for the cameras. But Stacy saw the cracks beneath the surface, the flashes of anger in his eyes, the veiled threats in his words. For Stacy, the new marriage that had once felt like a fresh start now felt like a trap. And the more she struggled to find a way out, the tighter Drew's grip seemed to become. Stacy Peterson stood in the doorway of her home, the phone pressed tightly against her ear. Her voice, barely a whisper, trembled with urgency. "Cass," she said, addressing her sister Cassandra, "I don't feel safe here anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Drew's car was parked just outside, its presence a constant reminder of his looming control. Stacy's eyes darted nervously toward the window. "If something happens to me," she added, "promise me you'll take care of the kids." Cassandra's voice cracked on the other end. "What are you saying, Stacy? You're scaring me." But Stacy had already said too much. "I'll call you later," she murmured, ending the call and slipping the phone back into her pocket. She couldn't risk Drew overhearing. Not again. The unease that had taken root in Stacy's heart was growing by the day. Each moment felt like a delicate balancing act, with Drew's moods dictating the tone of the household. She had learned to anticipate his anger, the sharp change in his tone, the way his jaw tightened when she asked too many questions. Drew didn't have to raise his voice for her to feel the weight of his authority. His silence was punishment enough. That evening, as Drew sat on the couch flipping through television channels, Stacy busied herself in the kitchen trying to appear normal. The hum of the microwave and the clatter of dishes filled the space between them, but tension crackled in the air. Drew's voice cut through the noise suddenly, startling her. "You've been acting strange," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Stacy froze, her back turned to him. She gripped the edge of the counter, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'm just tired," she replied, her words rehearsed and careful. Drew didn't respond, but she could feel his gaze burning into her back. Later that night, when Drew finally fell asleep, Stacy crept into the bathroom and locked the door. She turned on the faucet, letting the water mask her hushed sobs as she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. It was Kathleen's letter, the one she'd found weeks earlier, hidden in Drew's basement files. The words echoed in her mind. "He said he could kill me and make it look like an accident." Stacy had shown the letter to her pastor, Neil Shorey, during a private meeting at the church. She had confessed everything to him: Drew's controlling behavior, her suspicions about Kathleen's death, and the growing fear that she might be next. "I don't know what to do," she had told him, tears streaming down her face. Neil had urged her to come forward to report what she knew. But Stacy had hesitated. "What if no one believes me?" she had asked. "He's a cop. He knows how to hide things." Now, staring at her reflection in the mirror, Stacy felt trapped. Every part of her wanted to run, to grab her kids and leave, but the invisible chains Drew had wrapped around her life held her back. He had made it clear, leaving wasn't an option. "You're mine," he had told her once, his voice calm but laced with menace, "and I always get what's mine." The next morning, Stacy tried to push her fears aside as she prepared breakfast for the kids. Her youngest giggled as he played with his cereal, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Stacy envied their innocence. She kissed his forehead, lingering a moment longer than usual. "Mommy loves you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Drew walked into the kitchen, his presence filling the room. He kissed Stacy on the cheek, the gesture as mechanical as ever. "What's the plan today?" he asked, his tone casual. Stacy forced a smile. "Just errands," she said, avoiding his gaze. Drew nodded, but there was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Don't be gone too long," he added before walking out. Stacy exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. For now, she had avoided another confrontation. But as the day stretched on, Stacy couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Her fear wasn't just for herself. It was for her children, for the life she had built and the secrets she now carried. She knew she couldn't stay silent forever, but the question loomed. When the time came to act, would she have the strength to stand against Drew? On the crisp morning of October 28, 2007, Stacy Peterson left her home for what seemed to be an ordinary day. "I'm running errands," she told Drew casually over breakfast. She placed her mug in the sink and grabbed her keys. Drew watched her closely, his eyes narrowing, but said nothing. "Be back soon," he muttered, his tone carrying an undertone of warning. Stacy forced a smile, hiding the fear that churned in her stomach. Outside, the suburban neighborhood buzzed with life. Neighbors mowed their lawns, children rode their bikes, and the faint hum of passing cars filled the air. But for Stacy, it felt like the world was closing in. She glanced over her shoulder as she pulled out of the driveway, her heart racing. Drew had been more controlling than usual lately, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. As the hours passed, Drew began to grow impatient. By mid-afternoon, he called Stacy's phone, his irritation thinly veiled. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. By evening, his frustration had boiled into anger. "Where the hell is she?" he snapped to no one in particular. He stormed out of the house, leaving the kids with their babysitter, and drove aimlessly through Bolingbrook, scanning the streets for any sign of Stacy's car. When he returned home later that night, Drew placed a call to her sister, Cassandra. "Have you heard from Stacy?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Cassandra's heart sank. "No," she replied, her concern evident. "Isn't she home?" Drew sighed. "She said she needed some time to herself. Probably ran off with someone." The words hit Cassandra like a punch to the gut. "Ran off? With who?" she demanded. Drew chuckled darkly. "You know how she is, always restless." But Cassandra didn't believe him, not for a second. Stacy would never leave her children. She knew her sister well enough to know that. Cassandra's panic grew with each passing hour. She began calling Stacy's friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard from her, but no one had. Stacy had vanished without a trace. The next morning, the Bolingbrook Police Department issued a missing person alert. Volunteers flooded the area, combing through parks, forests, and waterways. News cameras captured the somber faces of friends and family as they handed out flyers, each bearing Stacy's smiling photo and the words, "Have you seen her?" Drew, meanwhile, maintained an air of indifference. "She left me," he told reporters, his tone detached. "She's with another man." Behind the scenes, Cassandra was relentless. She knew Stacy wouldn't leave her kids, not willingly. "She was scared," Cassandra told police. "She told me something wasn't right, that she didn't feel safe." But without evidence of foul play, authorities were limited in their ability to act. A breakthrough came days later when a neighbor reported something unusual. "I saw Drew the night Stacy disappeared," the neighbor told investigators. "He was loading a large blue barrel into his SUV. It looked heavy. He was struggling with it." The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Could the blue barrel hold the key to Stacy's disappearance? Drew denied everything. "I was moving some old equipment," he explained nonchalantly. People love to gossip. But the story didn't add up. The timeline, the lack of communication from Stacy, the barrel, it all pointed to something far darker. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The search for Stacy continued, but the trail grew colder with each passing day. Drew's behavior only deepened suspicions. At one point, he joked with a reporter, "Maybe she's on a beach somewhere, sipping margaritas." The comment sparked outrage, further painting him as cold and unbothered by his wife's disappearance. For Cassandra, the weight of it all was unbearable. She replayed every conversation she'd had with Stacy in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. "She told me she felt trapped," Cassandra whispered during an interview. "She said she didn't know how to get out." The Blue Barrel sighting became the center of speculation, but no concrete evidence emerged. Drew continued to live his life as if nothing had happened, while the Peterson children, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, waited for their mother to come home. By the end of October, the case had gripped the nation. Stacy Peterson wasn't just a missing woman. She was a symbol of something more profound. A mother of two, a vibrant young woman, swallowed by circumstances she couldn't escape. Her family refused to give up, but the reality was undeniable. Stacy Peterson was gone. Kathleen Savio's name had become a distant echo in Bolingbrook, buried beneath Drew Peterson's new marriage and Stacy's shocking disappearance. But her voice, silenced years earlier, was about to resurface, louder and clearer than ever before. The unraveling of Drew's carefully constructed facade began with a single question. Could Kathleen's death have been murder? Cassandra Cales, relentless in her pursuit of justice for Stacy, was the first to make the connection. "It's all tied together," she insisted during one of her many meetings with investigators. Kathleen's death, Stacy's disappearance, Drew's behind it all. Her plea struck a chord with lead investigator James Glasgow, who had harbored doubts about Kathleen's supposed accidental drowning since the case was first closed. Stacy's disappearance had reopened old wounds, and now the cracks in Drew's story were impossible to ignore. The decision to exhume Kathleen's body came quickly. Her family, still mourning her loss, agreed with trembling hands. "If it gives us answers," her sister Anna said, her voice shaking, "then we have to do it." The news sent shockwaves through the town. Drew, ever the performer, brushed off the announcement with unsettling nonchalance. "They're just looking for someone to blame," he told reporters with a smirk. Kathleen's death was an accident, plain and simple. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic experts armed with modern technology conducted a second autopsy. The results were damning. Kathleen had not drowned. She had been beaten, her body showing signs of a violent struggle before her death. The laceration on her head, once dismissed as a result of a fall, was now determined to have been caused by blunt force trauma. This was no accident, it was murder. As these findings emerged, Kathleen's own words came back to haunt Drew. Her handwritten notes, once ignored, were now central to the case. "He said he would kill me," one entry read, "and make it look like an accident." Each line painted a chilling picture of a woman living in fear, her pleas for help unheard until it was too late. The town, once charmed by Drew's charisma, began to turn against him. Neighbors whispered about his controlling nature, his volatile temper. "We all saw the signs," one former colleague admitted. "We just didn't want to believe them." Drew's calm demeanor, so carefully maintained, began to crack under the weight of scrutiny. When asked about the autopsy results, his response was curt. "People die. That's life." Kathleen's family, vindicated but heartbroken, refused to let her memory fade again. At a public vigil held in her honor, Anna addressed the crowd with tears streaming down her face. "She knew this would happen," Anna said, clutching Kathleen's notebook tightly. "She tried to warn us, but we didn't listen." For investigators, the new evidence provided the momentum they needed to press charges. Drew Peterson was arrested for Kathleen's murder in 2009, his once pristine reputation now in tatters. The case, now a national spectacle, became a rallying cry for victims of domestic violence. Kathleen's story, once silenced, had become a symbol of resilience and justice. But for Stacy's family, the fight was far from over. Her body was still missing, her fate uncertain. As Cassandra watched Drew being led away in handcuffs, she felt a flicker of hope. Kathleen's voice had returned, and now, she prayed, Stacy's would too. The courtroom was silent as Drew Peterson entered, flanked by officers. The once proud Bolingbrook cop, a man known for his charisma and confidence, now wore an orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his larger-than-life persona. He scanned the room, his face unreadable, as dozens of eyes followed his every move. Kathleen Savio's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and determination. For them, this trial was about more than justice. It was about giving Kathleen her voice back. As the trial began, prosecutors wasted no time painting a damning portrait of Drew. Lead prosecutor James Glasgow stepped forward, his voice steady yet charged with emotion. Kathleen Savio didn't slip. She didn't fall. She was murdered, he declared, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. He gestured to the jury. And the evidence will show that the person responsible is sitting right there. The evidence was overwhelming. Kathleen's autopsy results were presented first, with a forensic pathologist detailing the bruises on her body and the blunt force trauma to her head. These injuries are not consistent with an accidental fall, the expert testified. They indicate a violent struggle. Kathleen's handwritten notes were next. The prosecutor read aloud excerpts that filled the room with a chilling sense of foreboding. "He said he could kill me and make it look like an accident," one entry read. Another, "I'm scared of what he might do." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the weight of her words settling heavily over the jury. But the most shocking testimony came from Neil Shorey, Stacy Peterson's pastor. Taking the stand, Neil recounted a private conversation he'd had with Stacy shortly before her disappearance. "She told me Drew had confessed to killing Kathleen," Neil said, his voice steady but somber. "He said it was easy, that no one would ever find out." The jury leaned forward in their seats, their eyes locked on Neil. His testimony not only connected Drew to Kathleen's death, but also cast a dark shadow over Stacy's disappearance. For Kathleen's family, it was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Stacy's words, spoken in confidence, had become a lifeline for their fight for justice. Drew's defense team, led by a seasoned attorney with a reputation for theatrics, tried to discredit the prosecution's case. They argued that Kathleen's death was indeed an accident, pointing to the lack of direct evidence tying Drew to the scene. "This is a witch hunt," the defense attorney proclaimed, pacing before the jury. "My client is a victim of public hysteria, fueled by speculation and gossip." But the defense's arguments faltered under the weight of testimony after testimony. Kathleen's friends and family painted a vivid picture of her fear in the months leading up to her death. A former colleague of Drew's testified that he had boasted about knowing how to manipulate crime scenes. "He always said, 'If you know the system, you can beat it,'" the colleague revealed. Still, Drew remained calm. He smirked at times, whispering to his attorney, even laughing during breaks. His confidence seemed unshakable, but for those watching closely, it was unnerving. "He doesn't care," Kathleen's sister Anna whispered to her husband. "He thinks he's untouchable." The prosecution's final blow came when a neighbor testified about seeing Drew the night Kathleen was found dead. "He was near her house," the neighbor said, her voice trembling. "He looked agitated, like he didn't want to be seen." Closing arguments brought the trial to its emotional peak. Prosecutor Glasgow addressed the jury one last time. "Kathleen Savio was robbed of her life, her future, and her family," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "She begged for help and no one listened. But today, you have the power to make sure her voice is finally heard." The jury deliberated for hours, their faces grim as they reviewed the mountain of evidence. Outside, a crowd gathered, reporters jostling for space as they awaited the verdict. Drew, for the first time, seemed tense. His hands fidgeted, his smirk replaced by a clenched jaw. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Drew Peterson, guilty of the murder of Kathleen Savio." Gasps filled the courtroom as Kathleen's family broke down in tears. Drew sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The gavel struck, signaling the end of a trial that had captivated the nation. For Kathleen's loved ones, it was a moment of bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, but the scars of her loss would remain. As Drew was led away, Cassandra Cales watched from the back of the courtroom. Stacy's name hadn't been mentioned in the verdict, but her presence was felt in every word of the trial. "We're not done yet," Cassandra whispered to herself. "Not until Stacy comes home." The courtroom was electric with tension. Drew Peterson sat at the defense table, his face stoic, his hands clasped in front of him. For weeks, the trial had unfolded with shocking testimony, damning evidence, and moments of raw emotion. Now, the jury had returned with their decision. The room held its collective breath as the foreperson stood, holding the verdict in trembling hands. Kathleen Savio's family leaned forward, their fingers gripping one another tightly. Cassandra Cales sat further back, her eyes fixed on Drew, silently willing the jury to see the truth. This wasn't just about Kathleen anymore. It was about Stacy, too. The judge's voice broke the silence. Has the jury reached a verdict, he asked. The foreperson nodded, handing over the slip of paper. Time seemed to freeze as the judge unfolded it. The room hung on his every word. We, the jury, find the defendant, Drew Peterson, guilty of the murder of Kathleen Savio. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Kathleen's family burst into tears, their quiet sobs echoing in the stillness. Anna, her sister, buried her face in her hands, relief and grief washing over her all at once. Cassandra closed her eyes, clutching her seat as if to steady herself. For the first time, someone had held Drew accountable. Drew, however, didn't flinch. His expression remained eerily calm, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. To him, this was just another game, a battle he'd lost perhaps, but not the war. The prosecutor, James Glasgow, watched him carefully, his own sense of victory tempered by the knowledge of Stacy's unresolved disappearance. Justice had been served for Kathleen, but one question loomed. Where was Stacy? The judge's voice cut through the noise, delivering the sentence. Drew Peterson, you are hereby sentenced to 38 years in prison for the murder of Kathleen Savio. The gavel struck, and with it, the room erupted. Outside, reporters swarmed Kathleen's family as they exited the courthouse. Anna stood tall despite her tears, clutching a photo of Kathleen to her chest. This is for you, Kathy, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. We did it. We finally did it. But not all were satisfied. Cassandra stood apart, scanning the crowd for a glimpse of Drew being led away. When she finally saw him shackled and flanked by guards, her anger flared. You're not done, she whispered, her fists clenched. You'll answer for Stacy, too. One day, we'll find her. The trial's conclusion reverberated across the nation. Drew's conviction was a rare moment of justice in a system that often failed women like Kathleen. Her story, her fear, her warnings, her ultimate murder became a rallying cry. Advocates for domestic violence survivors took to the airwaves, urging others to speak up, to demand better protections. Yet for all its impact, the case still felt incomplete. Drew had been convicted, but Stacy remained missing. Her absence lingered like a shadow over the courtroom, her voice heard only through the testimonies of others. For Cassandra, the fight wasn't over. She vowed to keep searching, to keep pushing for answers. As Drew was escorted to a waiting transport vehicle, he turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the crowd. His smirk returned, a small but defiant gesture. For a moment, it was as if nothing had changed, as if he still held the upper hand. But the bars awaiting him told a different story. His reign of control was over. Inside the courthouse, Kathleen's family gathered their belongings, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. They had achieved justice, but it had come at an unbearable cost. Anna paused at the exit, looking back at the empty courtroom one last time. She deserved more, she whispered, before walking out into the glaring light of the cameras. And though the trial had ended, the questions remained. What had truly happened to Stacy Peterson? Would she ever be found? As the crowd dispersed and the courthouse emptied, one thing was clear. The fight for answers was far from over. The echoes of the gavel from Drew Peterson's conviction had barely faded. Yet for Cassandra Cales, the fight was far from over. Stacy's absence was a wound that refused to heal, a question that lingered in every conversation, every headline. Where was Stacy Peterson? The courtroom had given Kathleen her justice, but Stacy's story remained unfinished. Cassandra sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photographs of Stacy. Each one seemed to capture her sister's bright smile and sparkling eyes, a stark contrast to the fear she had confided in the months before her disappearance. She wanted out, Cassandra whispered to herself, but he wouldn't let her go. The media circus surrounding Drew's conviction reignited public interest in Stacy's case. Tips poured into the Bolingbrook Police Department, ranging from the absurd to the chillingly plausible. One caller claimed to have seen Drew late at night near a construction site. Another spoke of a canal where Drew allegedly dumped the blue barrel seen by a neighbor. Each lead was investigated, but none yielded answers. Cassandra, however, couldn't let go of the image of that blue barrel. It haunted her dreams, taunting her with its potential significance. She took matters into her own hands, organizing independent search efforts. Volunteers scoured forests, lakes, and abandoned properties, but the search seemed endless. The results always the same: nothing. Despite the lack of evidence, Cassandra's resolve never wavered. She pushed for a renewed investigation, meeting with anyone who would listen: journalists, detectives, even former colleagues of Drew. Some shared stories of Drew's arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. He bragged about knowing how to hide things, one officer admitted. He thought he was smarter than everyone. Meanwhile, Drew settled into his prison sentence with the same unnerving confidence that had defined his trial. In letters to friends and interviews with the press, he maintained his innocence. "They wanted a scapegoat, and I was an easy target," he wrote in one statement. "Stacy left me, that's the truth." But those closest to Stacy knew better. Cassandra clung to the memory of their last phone call, Stacy's voice trembling as she said, "If anything happens to me, promise me you'll take care of my kids." That promise drove Cassandra forward, even as years passed with no new breakthroughs. In 2015, a tantalizing lead emerged. An anonymous letter arrived at the Bolingbrook Police Department, claiming that Stacy's remains were buried in a concrete barrier at a property Drew had worked on during his time as a police officer. Investigators arrived at the site with cadaver dogs, their presence reigniting hope for answers. Cameras lined the streets, capturing the heavy machinery tearing into the concrete. But when the search ended, it was yet another dead end. For Cassandra, the disappointment was crushing, but not enough to stop her. "She's out there somewhere," she told a reporter, "and I won't stop until we bring her home." The legacy of Drew Peterson's actions extended far beyond Bolingbrook. Kathleen and Stacy's stories sparked national conversations about domestic violence, manipulation, and the failings of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Advocates called for stricter measures to hold abusers accountable, while survivors shared their own stories, inspired by Kathleen's courage and Stacy's resilience. Yet, for all the progress, Cassandra felt the weight of the unresolved. She often visited Kathleen's grave, placing flowers and whispering prayers. "I'll find her," she would say, as if speaking to both Kathleen and Stacy. "I'll bring her back to us." As the sun set over Bolingbrook one evening, Cassandra sat by a lake where search efforts had once taken place. The water shimmered under the fading light, calm and indifferent. She closed her eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves. "We're not done yet," she murmured, "not until Stacy comes home." Drew Peterson remained behind bars, his charm and arrogance reduced to bitter recollections of a man who once thought himself invincible. But even from prison, he loomed large in the lives of those he had hurt. The answers he held, if he held them at all, remained locked away, just like him. Stacy Peterson's story was unfinished, but her memory burned bright in the hearts of those who loved her. For Cassandra, the search was not just about finding Stacy, it was about honoring her sister's life, her strength, and her voice. And until that day came, she would not rest.